The sky above Amsterdam was gray, its reflection shimmering in the quiet waters of the Prinsengracht Canal. Sophie de Vries adjusted her scarf as she stepped out of the tram near the university. It was her first day at the Conservatorium van Amsterdam, a dream she had carried since she was a child playing piano in her grandmother's flat above a flower shop in Jordan. Inside the historic building, she walked with nervous anticipation through the halls, the sounds of violins and cellos echoing softly. Sophie had never felt more alive. Her hands trembled as she held onto her music folder. She had come here for one thing, to become a composer, not just a pianist. A creator of sound, not merely a performer of someone else's ideas. Her first class was already underway when she slipped into the room, eyes scanning for an empty seat. That was when she first saw him, Elias van Dijk. Tall, sharp-featured, dressed in black from coat to boots, with a stare that felt like it could slice through silence. He looked at her, then at the seat beside him, nodding once. She sat down. Elias spoke only once during the lecture, and it was enough to hush the room. The problem with most composers today, he said, is that they think emotion makes music. But structure, form, that's where true genius lies. Sophie blinked. There was a coldness in his tone, but also brilliance. After class, Elias approached her near the stairwell. "You're new," he said, his Dutch accent softened with British inflection. "Let me guess. You want to express your soul through melodies?" Sophie gave a small laugh. "Something like that." He smirked. "That's cute. But let me give you a piece of advice. If you really want to make it here, you'll have to unlearn everything sentimental. Music is mathematics. Emotion is weakness." It was the first moment she realized Elias might not be just another student.
He was an idea.
A challenge. Maybe even a warning. But instead of walking away, Sophie found herself curious. Very curious. The days that followed were filled with lectures, rehearsals, and early morning walks along the canals where mist hung like a soft veil over the cobblestones. Sophie had quickly become one of the most promising new students. Her compositions were praised for their rawness, their ability to stir emotion. But there was always one person who seemed unimpressed, Elias. He had a strange way of appearing when she least expected it. Outside the library. Behind her in the rehearsal room. Once, even in the cafe near the Museumplein where she liked to sit and write notes in her leather-bound journal. "You use too much crescendo," he said casually, dropping his tray beside hers. "It's a cheap way to evoke feeling." Sophie glanced up. "It's part of the language." "No," Elias said, eyes narrowing. "It's decoration. And decoration is distraction. You need to strip everything down. Simplicity. Order." At first, she dismissed his comments. But something about the certainty in his voice made her second-guess herself. Slowly, Sophie began changing her pieces. Fewer embellishments. More structure. She did not realize it then, but his voice had started to live inside her head. He never praised her, but he kept coming back. One afternoon, after a workshop where the professor had commended her piece, Elias waited for her outside the practice rooms. "You are improving," he said, his tone flat. "At least now it doesn't sound like someone crying into a pillow." Sophie laughed despite herself. "That was your version of a compliment?" Elias shrugged. "Call it what you want. But if you want more than applause, you will have to stop writing for them and start writing for the mind." Something in her wanted to prove him wrong. Yet another part, a quieter one, wanted to prove him right. And so, day by day, she listened. She followed. Until she no longer played for herself. Winter descended on Amsterdam with quiet force. The trees along the canals were bare, their reflections black against the frozen water. Sophie now wore wool coats and thick scarves, but nothing shielded her from the growing chill inside her own mind. Elias's influence had become constant. They were never officially close, yet he was always near. He never touched her, never raised his voice. But his presence carried weight, like gravity. When she wrote something he did not approve of, he would not criticize, he would simply leave. And that silence hurt more than words ever could. During one rehearsal, she played a new piece that she had written in secret. It was full of emotion, returning to her old style. For the first time in weeks, she felt herself again. Afterwards, Elias walked past her without a word. Later that evening, she found a note slipped under her practice room door. It read, "You disappoint me." No name, no signature. But she knew. That night, she wandered alone through Vondel Park. The wind bit through her gloves. Her fingers, the very tools of her craft, felt numb. She sat on a bench and cried for the first time since arriving in Amsterdam. What was she becoming? She no longer visited the cafe. She skipped social events. The once vibrant melodies in her mind now echoed with doubt. At times, she would catch herself repeating Elias's phrases as if they were her own thoughts. Simplicity, precision, order. Her professors noticed. Her music grew colder, more perfect, less alive. Still, Elias seemed satisfied. And somehow, that mattered more than it should have. By early January, the frost never melted from the windows of the practice hall. Sophie's days followed a strict rhythm, dictated more by Elias's expectations than her own passion. She composed on command, adjusted her playing to his preferences, and avoided eye contact when her melodies betrayed too much soul. One morning, during a solo workshop, she played a composition that once would have made her heart race. The notes were haunting, rich, full of contradiction. But halfway through, Elias stood from the back row and interrupted. "This lacks discipline," he said, his voice calm. "You're losing control." The room fell silent. A few students exchanged nervous glances. Sophie stared at her hands, which trembled slightly on the keys. Afterwards, she did not cry. She simply walked to the nearest tram and rode without destination, her scarf pulled high over her face. When she passed by a street musician playing a chaotic, vibrant tune on the accordion, something inside her stirred, a memory of freedom. That evening, she revisited an old notebook she had kept hidden. Pages filled with raw, defiant compositions, ones that Elias would scoff at. She ran her fingers over the ink, as if touching a forgotten part of herself. The next day, without telling anyone, she returned to her favorite canal bridge, the one she used to sketch by in the early autumn. She sat there with her headphones in, listening to the messy, imperfect tracks she used to record. And she smiled. It lasted only a moment, but it was real. Later that night, she received another note under her door. "You are drifting." This time, she tore it into pieces. The crack in the mirror had formed, and through it, she could finally glimpse her own reflection. Amsterdam's winter rains returned with a vengeance, drumming steadily against the rooftops and turning the cobbled streets slick with reflections. Sophie found herself walking without an umbrella, letting the water soak into her coat and drip from her eyelashes. It was the only time she felt untouched by expectations. At the conservatory, Elias grew colder. He no longer offered quiet praise, only silence or criticism, and his comments grew sharper. Yet Sophie had begun to respond differently. She still nodded, still obeyed, but something in her eyes had changed. One evening, as she prepared to leave the practice room, she noticed a small paper slipped into the pocket of her coat. It was not from Elias. The handwriting was round, almost gentle. "You played beautifully today. Do not forget who you are." There was no name, just that single sentence. Her heart raced. She looked around, but the hallway was empty. The notes continued over the next week, always anonymous, always simple. Affirmations that landed like soft echoes from the past. They reminded her of her first days in the city, when music was hers alone and the canals whispered stories no one else could hear. She began composing again in secret, late at night in the student lounge when no one was watching. The pieces were strange, emotional, wild. They made her feel alive. But joy, in that building, did not go unnoticed. On a Sunday morning, Elias called her into his private office. The blinds were drawn. His desk was bare, but for a metronome ticking steadily. The moment she entered, he gestured for her to sit. "You've been distracted," he said. "Sloppy." "I've been inspired," Sophie replied, her voice even. He leaned forward. Not everything you feel belongs in your work. For the first time, she didn't look away. And not everything you demand belongs in mine. The silence that followed was heavier than any note she'd ever played. When she walked out of his office, rain was still falling, but this time, it felt warm on her skin. The next few weeks blurred into each other as winter deepened. The city of Amsterdam shimmered beneath a constant mist, and Sophie moved through it like someone half awake, half reborn. She continued to play during the day, obedient and measured, but each night her fingers danced freely across the keys, composing wild, unfiltered pieces that spilled out from her soul like a secret language. She kept them in a worn folder under her bed, titled only Voor Midge, for me. The anonymous notes had stopped, but the courage they sparked remained. One morning, she found a familiar figure waiting outside the conservatory gates. Eva, the girl who had left weeks ago in tears. Sophie hesitated, then walked up to her. "I heard what he did to you," Eva whispered. Sophie's breath caught. "I wasn't the only one," Eva continued. "He humiliated me too. But you were brave enough to stay." "No," Sophie replied softly. "I was too scared to leave." They stood in silence for a moment, watching a tram clatter past. Then Eva placed something in Sophie's hand. A small USB drive. "Recordings," she said. "Of him. What he says when no one else is around. You should hear it. You're not crazy." That night, Sophie plugged the drive into her laptop. Her hands trembled as she hit play. Elias's voice filled the room. Cold. Condescending. His words to students about them degrading, manipulative. Each clip was a confirmation of every instinct she'd buried. But the final clip made her go still. It was her own voice, recorded without her knowing. She was crying, asking him what she'd done wrong. His voice was calm, controlled, cruel. "You were never exceptional, Sophie. Just eager. That was your only strength." Something inside her shattered. Yet from those pieces came something unexpected, resolve. She returned to the conservatory the next day with the USB in her coat pocket and a choice weighing on her shoulders. She could continue to let him shape her, or she could step into her own music. The day after listening to the recordings, Sophie felt a strange lightness mixed with the weight of her decision. She had not told anyone yet, not even Eva. The conservatory's grand halls seemed colder now, the echoes of Elias's voice still ringing in her ears. She decided to act differently, not with anger, but with quiet defiance. Each time Elias tried to undermine her or others, Sophie responded with calm and firm dignity. She smiled politely, refused to engage in his games, and focused more intensely on her music. Word began to spread among the students. They noticed her change and, quietly, they started to follow. Small acts of kindness, whispers of encouragement, and shared stories of Elias's cruelty built a silent resistance. One evening, Sophie invited Eva and a few other students to her apartment overlooking the canals. They listened to the recordings together, their faces hardening with resolve. "We need to do something," Eva said. Sophie nodded, her eyes steady. But the question was what? Sophie and her friends knew they had to be careful. Elias was influential, and a direct confrontation could backfire badly. They started gathering more evidence quietly, collecting testimonies from other students who had suffered in silence. They also reached out to a sympathetic professor, Jan, who had always shown kindness towards Sophie. Jan promised to help them bring the truth to the conservatory's board without exposing the students. Meanwhile, Elias remained unaware that his carefully maintained power was slipping. Sophie noticed him watching her more often, his eyes narrowing whenever she spoke or smiled in defiance. One evening, Sophie received a message from an anonymous source. "Meet me at the cafe near the canal. I have something you need." The cafe was dimly lit, filled with the scent of fresh coffee and distant jazz music. Sophie's heart pounded as she scanned the room. A young woman waved at her from a shadowed corner. She approached, clutching a small envelope. Inside were photos, pictures of Elias in moments that contradicted his public image, evidence of manipulation and lies. Sophie folded the papers carefully. This was the break they needed. With the new evidence in hand, Sophie and the group felt ready to confront the truth. They arranged a meeting with the conservatory's board, with Professor Jan's support ensuring their voices would be heard. The room was tense as Sophie presented the photos, recordings, and testimonies. Faces around the table shifted from disbelief to concern. Elias sat silently, his usual confidence cracked but not broken. Questions were asked and promises made to investigate. For the first time, the power balance began to shift in the conservatory. Outside, as Sophie walked along the canals, she felt a mix of relief and uncertainty. The battle was far from over, but the silence had finally been broken. Weeks passed with a slow but steady investigation. The conservatory faced scrutiny from the city, and media whispers grew louder. Elias found himself isolated, his influence waning. One evening, Sophie received a message inviting her to a private meeting with the conservatory's director. The air was thick with tension as she entered the grand office overlooking the canal. The director spoke calmly but firmly, acknowledging the wrongs and promising change. There was an offer of restitution, a chance to rebuild trust and safety within the institution. Sophie knew this was only the beginning. The scars left by Elias's cruelty would take time to heal, but the community's courage to speak up had sparked a new chapter for the conservatory.